There is a powder that costs $3 and makes wood last 500 years. Not treated wood. Not pressure washed and resealed wood. Not wood soaked in chemical cocktails that off-gas for a decade and still cracked by year 3. Regular wood. Pine, oak, cedar, whatever you have lying in your yard or rotting on your fence line right now. One application, mixed in a bucket with water and a handful of cheap ingredients you can find at any grocery or hardware store, and that wood will outlast the building it is attached to. Viking shipbuilders used it. Norwegian stave churches built in the 11th century are still standing because of it. Indigenous communities across Scandinavia, the Pacific Northwest, and the Andes have preserved timber with this method for over 2,000 years without a single patent, a single brand name, or a single dollar going to a corporation. The global wood treatment industry generates over $200 billion annually. Rot and weather damage are the single biggest reasons people replace decking, fencing, siding, and structural timber. A $3 permanent solution does not fit inside that business model. It never did. This is the story of pine tar, the wood preservative that civilizations trusted and the lumber industry quietly retired. Let me take you back to where the story actually starts, because it does not begin in a factory or a research lab. It begins on a coastline in northern Europe around the year 800, where men were building ships from pine and spruce in a IT climate designed to destroy both. The air in coastal Scandinavia carries salt, moisture, and cold in concentrations that reduce untreated timber to soft gray pulp within a handful of seasons. And yet the Norse built vessels that crossed the North Atlantic, survived pack ice, endured years of continuous saltwater exposure, and in some documented cases remained seaworthy for 3 and 4 decades. And they were not using anything exotic. They were using what the forest gave them. When pine trees are wounded, they bleed. The thick amber resin that seeps from a cut or a broken branch is the tree defending itself against moisture, fungi, insects, and rot. It has been doing this for millions of years, and it is extraordinarily good at it. The Norse discovered that if you heated pine roots and stumps slowly in a sealed clay kiln with restricted oxygen, that same resin condensed and dripped out in a dark, viscous liquid that retained every protective property of the living tree. They called it TJ, we call it pine tar, and once they understood what it did to timber, they put it on everything. Ship hulls were coated in every season before launch. The wood absorbed it deeply into the grain, rather than merely being sealed on the surface, which meant the protection lived inside the fiber of the timber, rather than sitting on top waiting for the first impact of scrape to breach it. Masts, deck planking, oar shafts, rope, leather rigging, and even the woolen sails on some vessels were treated with diluted pine tar solutions. Contemporary accounts and archaeological analysis of Viking-era ship remains both confirm the same finding. The tar penetrated 2 to 3 centimeters into the grain in some samples, essentially converting the outer layer of the wood into something that behaved more like resinous heartwood than exposed sapwood. Rot organisms cannot colonize it. Water cannot saturate it. Insects cannot tunnel through it. The knowledge traveled as Norse traders and settlers moved south and west. In medieval England, naval shipwrights adopted pine tar for the royal fleet. Timber frame buildings in northern Germany were routinely coated in it before the plaster and wattle infill was applied, which is why some of those structures have stood for 6 and 7 centuries while modern timber frame construction begins, showing moisture damage within a decade. In Sweden, a tradition of painting rural farmhouses and outbuildings in a pine tar mixture called fallen red became so culturally embedded that it persisted uninterrupted from the 16th century into the 20th. Some of those buildings have never been replaced. They have only been recoated. Now, I want to stop here for a moment and say something directly to whoever is watching this. I started this channel because I was genuinely angry. Angry that I had spent years maintaining a cedar deck with expensive branded sealers that lasted 14 months if I was lucky. While doing research one evening, I stumbled onto 19th century shipbuilding manuals casually describing wood treatments that outperformed anything I had ever used. I was not angry at the brands, exactly. I was angry at the gap. The gap between what we actually know and what we are sold. And if what I am saying is landing for you the same way it landed for me when I first found it, I would be genuinely glad if you subscribed, not because the algorithm rewards it though. It does. But because I make these videos hoping they reach people who will actually use the information. And subscribing is the only way. I know you are out there. Back to the chemistry, because this is where it gets serious. Pine tar is a complex mixture of over 200 organic compounds, but the ones doing the heavy work fall into three categories. Phenolic compounds, which are natural antimicrobials that actively inhibit fungal colonization, the primary mechanism of wood rot. Resin acids, which are hydrophobic molecules that bind to wood fiber and physically displace water from the grain, preventing the moisture saturation that rot organisms require to survive, and aromatic hydrocarbons, which create a surface film that resists ultraviolet degradation, the process that turns exposed wood gray and brittle. And structurally compromised over time, these three mechanisms working simultaneously explain something that purely film-forming sealers cannot match. Pine tar does not just delay deterioration. It interrupts the biological and chemical processes that cause it. Modern pressure-treated lumber uses chromated copper, arsenate, or alkaline copper, quaternary compounds forced into the wood under high pressure to achieve a similar antimicrobial result. The process requires industrial equipment, regulated chemicals, and generates waste streams that are classified as hazardous in most jurisdictions. Pine tar achieves a comparable outcome with a brush, a warm afternoon, and a product you can buy at a farm supply store or mix yourself from raw materials. The Norwegian stave church at Ørnes, built in approximately 1130 AD and still structurally sound today, was maintained for centuries using pine tar. No pressure treatment facility was involved. No EPA filing was required. A man with a bucket and a brush did the work, and it lasted nearly a millennium. Here's something I get asked constantly in the comments, and I want to address it before we move on. People write and say, if this is so effective and so cheap, why does nobody talk about it? And the honest answer, the one I keep coming back to after all the research I've done for this channel, is that nobody talks about it, because there is no economic incentive to talk about it. The lumber treatment industry in the United States alone is worth over $40 billion annually. That industry funds trade publications, sponsors, research, and advertises in the same magazines and websites where you might otherwise encounter an article explaining that Viking-era shipwrights had already solved the problem you're trying to solve. The information is not hidden behind a wall. It is buried under an avalanche of sponsored content, pointing you somewhere more expensive. So let me give you the actual method, because this is the part that matters, the part you can use this weekend on real wood with real results. And I want to say before I get into the steps that if you have a parent, a neighbor, a friend who owns a cabin, a fence, an old barn, anyone who has been throwing money at a wood rot problem and getting nowhere, please share this video with them. Not for my numbers, because this genuinely helps and most people will never find it on their own. That means something to me. Raw pine tar, which is what you want, is sold at farm supply stores and some veterinary supplies under names like Stockholm tar or natural pine tar. It has been used on horseshoes for centuries to prevent cracking and moisture damage, which is why it is still easy to find even though the lumber industry has largely moved on. A 1-liter tin costs between $5 and $8 and treats approximately 25 to 30 square feet of raw timber at full concentration, or substantially more when diluted for a penetrating first coat. That is the first thing most people get wrong. You do not start with full-strength tar on dry timber. You start thin and let the wood drink it. For the first application, mix raw pine tar with an equal part of raw linseed oil, not boiled linseed oil, which has been chemically modified, but raw linseed oil pressed from flaxseed. This diluted mixture has a viscosity and surface tension low enough to penetrate deep into open wood grain rather than filming over on the surface. Apply it with a natural bristle brush on a warm, dry day when the wood temperature is above 15 degrees Celsius. Warm wood is expanded slightly and the pores are more receptive to absorption. You will watch the mixture disappear into the surface over the first few minutes, rather than sitting on top. And that is exactly what you want. So what you are seeing is the resin acids and phenolic compounds migrating into the cellular structure of the wood fiber. Let this first coat absorb and dry for a full 48 hours. The second coat can be applied at full strength or at a 3-to-1 ratio of tar to linseed oil. By this point, the grain has been partially sealed by the first application, and the second coat builds the protective surface. Film. The color will deepen to a rich amber brown that darkens further with sun exposure over the following weeks as the aromatic compounds oxidize. It is not a paint. It does not hide the grain or the character of the wood. It enhances both while making them effectively permanent for timber that is going to be in-ground contact, fence posts, deck footings, structural sill plates. Add a third coat at full concentration before installation. Post bases treated this way and set in concrete have been excavated decades later, with the wood showing no degradation at the soil contact line. Cast iron and carbon steel tools can also be treated after cleaning and light sanding. A thin wipe of pine tar and linseed oil heated together in a ratio of 1:1, brushed onto the metal and cured in a low oven at around 150 degrees, creates a surface that behaves almost identically to a seasoned cast iron patina, but with the added antimicrobial and water-repellent properties of the tar. Japanese wood and metal workers use pine pitch treatments in exactly this way, for both their wooden tool handles and the iron heads attached to them. One treatment for 2 materials, 1 afternoon, and you are done. There is a moment I need to tell you about. Last autumn, I treated the fence boards on the north side of my property, the side that gets almost no direct sunlight and stays damp well into the afternoon, most days of the year. I used a brand name semi-transparent wood stain on the south side, as a comparison. Same age lumber, same conditions apart from the sun exposure difference. 6 months later, the treated north side fence looked exactly as it did the day I applied the pine tar. The south side, which I had paid 3 times as much to treat, had begun chalking at the top rail and was showing early. Signs of grain, checking at the end, cuts. I stood there in the rain looking at both sides, and I genuinely did not know whether to laugh or just feel tired. If that moment resonates with you, if you have had your own version of it, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what you spent money on, that you later found out was completely unnecessary. I read everything. The suppression of this knowledge, if we want to call it that, is less of a conspiracy than it is a slow institutional forgetting driven by profit incentive. Nobody sat in a boardroom and voted to erase pine tar from the cultural memory. What happened is simpler and sadder than that. Each generation of homeowners inherited the maintenance practices of the one before it. When petroleum-based products became cheap and heavily marketed in the post-war period, hardware stores made more margin selling them, builders specified them in contracts, and the older botanical methods simply stopped being passed down because nobody was paid to pass them down. Your grandfather may have known about pine tar. His grandfather certainly did, but the chain broke somewhere around 1960, and the industry had no reason to repair it. The irony is that the chemistry underpinning modern wood treatment products is, in many formulations, partially derived from the same phenolic compounds found in pine tar, coal tar, which was used extensively in the 19th and early 20th century as a timber preservative before being phased out for health reasons, is a related compound, creosote, which the railway industry used to preserve wooden sleepers for over a century, is a fractional distillation product of coal tar. The entire history of industrial wood preservation is a history of scientists isolating, concentrating, and repackaging the same organic chemistry that forests had already developed over millions of years, then selling it back to us at scale with a brand name attached. You do not need the brand name. You need the bucket, the brush, and about $40 worth of materials that will last you several years of applications on every wooden surface you own. The Viking ships did not rot in the fjords because the men who built them paid attention to what the forest was already doing and decided to help it along. That is the entirety of the knowledge. Everything else is packaging. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. I mean that without any performance in it. These videos take a long time to research, and I make them because I believe the information matters. Not because the algorithm is particularly generous to this kind of content. If you want to see more of it, subscribing genuinely helps. And if you know someone who is about to spend real money on a wood treatment project, send them this first and let them decide with the full picture in front of them. That is all I'm asking.